This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. Please seek out professionals in those fields if you need those services. The views expressed by the hosts of Adoptees On or any guests are their own and do not represent the opinions of any organization or other person unless otherwise stated. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 197, Donna and Sara. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Today, we are back in the spirituality series, and we are taking a look at cults and high-demand groups. My guests have both been impacted by cults, and they have a theory that adopted people may be more susceptible to these type of groups. If you hear me say that and immediately think, this wouldn't happen to me, make sure you keep listening. Donna and Sara have extensively researched high-demand groups since they got out and have a ton of wisdom to share with us. I want to let you know that we'll be talking about some difficult subject matter today, including child harm. We will wrap up with some recommended resources for you, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I am so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On. Welcome back to Adoptees On, Donna. Hi, Donna.
Hi there. Nice to be with you again.
Yes, I'm so glad you're back. And Sara Easterly. Hi, Sara.
Hi, Haley. Good to be back.
I've been anticipating our conversation today. It is going to be a little different from some of the other episodes we've done. And you both approached me actually well over a year ago with this topic. So I know it's been circulating in your minds for a long time. And so I'm going to ask you to share your stories, but we're going to go a little bit of a different direction. So Donna and Sara have both been on the podcast before and have shared their adoptee stories with us. And I'll link those episodes in the show notes. But today, Donna, I'm going to give it over to you. And would you share some of your story with us?
So I'm a first-generation domestic adoptee and a second-generation international adoptee. I was a closed adoption at the last edges of the baby scoop era. And I did my first search when I was 20 and found out that my birth mother, who was an Ecuadorian adoptee, had completed suicide 3 years after she relinquished me. I reunited with my birth father around that time, and I found out that my birth parents were part of a spiritualist commune in the Arizona desert. From my birth mother's description in the non-identifying case notes that I was able to obtain, it did sound like a cult. And there was also, as part of my backstory, a different spiritual community than the one my birth parents were in that was trying to convince my birth mother to keep me and come live with them, or possibly just to adopt me themselves. And it sounds like my birth mother adamantly didn't want me raised in these situations and didn't have other stable alternatives. So in some unfortunate ways, I seem to have carried on a family tradition. So spoiler alert.
Oh, no. And Sara, how about you?
Well, my adoption story I've shared at length, I know, so I'll try to do very fast here. But I was adopted when I was 2 days old in Billings, Montana. It was a domestic private adoption that took place at the tail end of the baby scoop era. I'd always been told it was a gray market adoption, but I never really knew what that meant. I liked the sound of it, though. It sounded exciting. But then when I went into reunion, when I finally, 39 years, at the age of 39, went into reunion with my birth mother, I came to learn that my adoption, what the gray market meant was that it was kind of pushing the edges, in my case, of what would have been considered legal. It was still legal, but it was it was just kind of a gray area, whether it was legal or not. It was a coerced situation, as was rather common for the time and the state, and with the doctor, I learned. And that's my adoption story in a nutshell. Yeah, I've never done it that fast.
Gold star for you. Yeah. Okay, so we are here, and Donna's hinted at this because you both approached me with this idea that you have this hypothesis that adopted folks are more susceptible or highly susceptible to being in cults or high pressure groups, high demand groups. There's a lot of different names for them. So Donna, would you share a bit of your story and experience with that and maybe talk a little bit about what that even means?
Yeah, well, I want to just kind of nerd out in the beginning and just lay a little bit of groundwork about what we mean when we say a cult and mind control and sort of the psychology of cult leaders. So we have a framework for this. And we use the term cult often very casually in popular culture. So I just want to do a little more of a formal definition. So a cultic system is formed and controlled by a charismatic authoritarian leader or leadership group. It is rigidly hierarchical and an isolating social system that is supported by a total exclusive ideology. The leader sets in motion processes of brainwashing or coercive persuasion designed to isolate and control followers. And as a result, followers are able to be exploited and they demonstrate obedience to the group regardless of their own survival needs. And then when we talk about mind control, it's also sometimes thought reform or undue influence. And it's a system that disrupts an individual's healthy identity development. So it seeks to undermine their integrity in making independent decisions by encouraging dependence and conformity and discouraging autonomy and individuality. This is usually done in very systematic and controlled ways. And there's also a lot of crossover with abusive relationships and domestic violence situations where abusers use many of the same methods of control. Cult leaders are typically on the spectrum of psychopaths, sociopaths, and traumatizing narcissists. Most likely, they've had a frightening and traumatic childhood. They see the world solely in terms of what serves their own needs. And it's by subjugating others that they seek to maintain what is often a messianic delusion. And so through control and abuse, they're essentially exporting their shame and the fear of their own inadequacies onto others, because if they held it themselves, it would destroy the omnipotent narrative that they've created as a defense against their own trauma. And lastly, I'll just say that cults exploit our basic biological instinct of attachment. So seeking comfort from others. This is innate for all of us. And they do this by using alternating methods of love and fear with teachings and situations that cause high levels of stress with no solution, like apocalyptic teachings. And this creates a trauma bond where the cult position themselves as one's only safe haven. And relational abuse like this can derail a person's ability to think logically and clearly about the group and group leader, as well as impacting other attachment relationships. So that framework is a mashup from Alexandra Stein, Daniel Shaw, and Stephen Hassan. They're all former group members. Stein was in a political group, Shaw was in a yoga-based guru cult, and Hassan was a Mooni or part of the Unification Church.
Thank you for that primer on cults. No, I appreciate that. And the other thing, you guys both sent me tons and tons of resources that I've been reading through and researching in preparation. Even as you describe it with there's this authoritarian leader and you're explaining those, that's not what you see when you see these groups. And when you and Sara describe your experience, which we're going to get into right away, you don't you don't join a group with this most often with this charismatic leader. That's not really what it looks like. So don't just check out because you're oh, this would never happen to me. Because no. Keep listening. Okay. Sara, what's your experience with this?
Well, so like you were just saying, I mean, it didn't start like any of that. I think I would have seen that a mile away. But basically what happened is 10 years ago, I joined a group of 9 other women for what I thought was a women's, a mother's getaway. The plans for the weekend retreat were rather vague. All I knew was that the person who invited me, who was a fellow student in a 12-week parenting course that I'd been taking, had mentioned that the woman who'd be running the retreat, who was our charismatic course facilitator, who I happen to greatly admire and secretly hope she might be my long-lost birth mother, had specifically mentioned that she hoped I'd come. So the flattery that I felt from her, and the thought of a 2-day break from the I mean, let's face it, I had two really young children, 15 months apart, and it's just a physically exhausting time parenting wise. So I didn't really need to know more. I was like, sure, a mother's getaway, that's what I assumed it was. And I was in. And that was my foray into what became a women's group. And I eventually came to recognize as a cult, but it did take 2 years for me to understand it as such, and a lot more years to shed the shame and fear, to even look at it and then share about it publicly. So I didn't join a cult. I joined an innocuous, hopeful-seeming women's group that promised personal transformation. And I will say, I know a woman who, our women's group, lived in a community. She talked about a spiritual lineage that to me smacked of a cult. Quite often, I'd research cults. I'd try to find the name of her community listed and telling myself that if I saw it on a list, then I'd know to steer clear. But I never found a list. I didn't realize that the International Cultic Studies Association has reasons they don't have such lists. And I also didn't realize cults don't start off asking for membership. They don't ask for followers. They don't require a move to their compound. They don't ask you right off the bat to drink poison Kool-Aid. So I just kept ignoring my intuition because I really had a strong drive at the time to heal. I'd spent my life feeling broken. From the outset, as so many of us as adoptees feel and experience, I believed something was wrong with me. My birth mother hadn't wanted me, and I believed it was me. I felt that wherever I went, I felt rejection was finding me and seemed to emphasize that I was broken. I was a hot mess. And I was dissatisfied with relationships. There were so many things that weren't working. I had an emptiness and a loneliness draping everything. My marriage, my relationship with my parents, my friends, this ever-present loneliness that I wanted fixed. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was starting to come out of the fog. It started with the birth of my daughter 3 years earlier, and then continued, of course, when my next daughter was born. And I just could no longer, it was just prickling. I could no longer deny that I was affected by relinquishment. Traditional therapy with therapists who I now recognize were not adoption competent, thank you for your healing series, had never worked for me. And the structure of the women's group felt like an alternative way to go about it. It felt like a combination of group therapy and something fresh. And the leader kept saying it wasn't traditional therapy, but she was a licensed therapist and she was a respected faculty member running parenting courses, which for me legitimized both her approach and her as a leader. So that was kind of how I got in terms of what the group was like. It started off benign. It was women meeting biweekly, supporting each other with whatever issues were alive for us. But because of how the meetings were structured, it required really deep vulnerability in order to belong and not to get called out. So there was a really fast progression to deeper levels of attachment without covering, if you know how attachment progresses, we didn't cover the basic first parts of attachment that are needed in relationships, such as having things in common. So we did have parenting in common. So sometimes parenting related frustrations or struggles were discussed, but most of what came up were issues about our marriages, and a lot of the sharing seemed to be about our mothers. And so what I didn't realize then is that cults need the primary attachments of its members out of the way. And so in our group, the constant analysis, the constant criticism of our families made me start seeing all of them through what I refer to as gray-colored glasses. I was looking for flaws. I was looking for wrongdoing. I was looking to place blame. And then it basically, as a result, too, the women's group became my primary place for all intimate sharing. So that was further eroding and undermining my closest relationships where my heart was really meant to be shared. The women's group became a competing attachment. In some ways, it was beneficial. The idea that we could be there to hold each other, I'm doing that in air quotes because that was a phrase, in times of crisis was helpful. I was coming out of the fog. I did need that. But there was also a lot of drama. As a sensitive person, it was really traumatic for me and confusing. And to this day, I'm still unsure how much of the drama was real and which circumstances, people, and relationships were fabricated in order to create disorder for the group. There was one very dramatic episode that resulted in our group being contacted by higher ranking people in the cult from the community that I mentioned that we'd never had a connection to before. So it did feel fabricated and part of the journey to create that trauma bonding that Donna referenced. There was another retreat that I attended. There was very irresponsible treatment. It was there was a mattress and this seminar with a mattress and a bucket to throw up in if things got too intense. And It's basically, I laid on this mattress and I went big. All of my 39 years of repressed adoption trauma just came out of me in a very public setting, public in the group. I think there were 12 people, 11 or 12 in that retreat. In a way, it was helpful. All of that needed to come out of me. But the way that it was handled by more people who were not informed about adoption, and frankly, the two people running that retreat were totally out of their depth, ended up inflicting a lot more trauma on me than it helped get out of me, and left me totally unsupported in the aftermath. And I basically had a breakdown. Once I landed back on my feet, it compelled me to search for my birth mother. So that was a good result, but the experience was dangerous. I put myself and my very young children in danger in the midst of that breakdown. And then there were like all kinds of other problems during my time in the cult. And Donna kind of spoke to some of these that reminded me that these were a factor in my experience. There were extreme hours of volunteer work at late hours in the day, which I realize now were part loyalty tests, part planned sleep deprivation. Boundaries were pushed, so many overlapping relationships, very unhealthy, but it allowed the leader to keep tabs on every area of my life. The sleep deprivation I mentioned, so that I would lose my critical thinking skills and just be too busy to stop and think. Manipulation, there was a lot of manipulation, disclosing to other members. I was doing personal therapy with the leader as well, and parenting therapy and marriage therapy. And so those details could be disclosed to other members in the groups, and then it could be used against me in these group settings. There was lying, there was grooming. That you're special, really hooked me as an adoptee. And just a lot of someone who's an attachment master who had studied attachment very completely, knew exactly how to mine attachment wounds. And I, as an adoptee, I have them. I have plenty. So there, I was right there. And basically I was living alarmed the whole time I was in the group. As an adoptee, the dynamics underlying a conflict group or an encounter group, which was what my group was, really tapped into my wounded places of needing to be good for, to fit in, to belong. I was constantly worried about making a misstep and having everybody leave me. And yet no matter what, if you shared or if you didn't share, you'd end up in what everybody called the hot seat, with the other women telling you what you did wrong to play a role in your suffering. So it was really hard to trust in that environment and to feel secure. And yet you're also being told it's a really secure, safe place. And we're holding you close. Everyone was vying for favorite status by the narcissistic leader. She kept tabs on everybody this way, because then everyone would tattle on each other to try to get in her good graces. And if you ever expressed any healthy skepticism or took a break from the times of drama, then you'd be called out for it in the next group.
Wow. And so you mentioned there was like this higher up organization that you had no idea that this group of 9 to 12 women were a part of. You had no idea.
Well, and I still don't have an idea. I mean, I had an idea. Like I said, I knew about the community that the leader was a part of. But the premise of the group when we formed was that we were all coming out of this course. So I think for a lot of the fellow women, they were the same as me coming out of this course. But then in hindsight, as information rolled out later, you kind of question, okay, some of them had existing relationships with the leader that preceded the group. And so who were part of it before, who knew about this, I don't know. It's kind of messes with your mind. I mean, I think most people in the group were in the same situation that I was in, just coming into it and not realizing. But I think there were some ways in that there was people were manipulated, and so I don't know if they were manipulated before or after, and who was and who wasn't. Just confusing.
Well, even in our first conversation to prepare for this, I kept thinking like, how is this a call? And as you described more and more of the very harmful things you were exposed to, I'm like, oh, okay, that's it. Because when you're talking about, women's group parenting, right? Like my mind does not just go straight to cult. Like it just doesn't. So I think that's just a reminder of like, calling it a cult. It doesn't necessarily look like what we have pictured in our head, like the Kool-Aid that you mentioned, poison Kool-Aid. Thank you for sharing that. Donna, what did it look like for you? What was your experience?
So I would now refer to my former group as a Buddhist-based spiritual and political cult. So it's certainly not how I was introduced to it, but that's how I refer to it now. It's an international group that originated outside of the United States, but is now based here. Many major cities have chapters. The local group that I participated with fluctuated probably between 45 to 90 plus participants. But I've also been to conferences that have filled stadiums with 3,000 to 5,000 people there from around the world. If I was to name the group, it would likely sound obscure and unfamiliar, but there are public-facing aspects that people might recognize and have unknowingly interacted with. So I have a background with traditional Chinese culture, martial arts, and meditation, and I've always been a bit of a seeker and like to explore different practices. So when I was introduced to this group, it didn't seem too foreign to me. It seemed, like familiar territory. For context, I was 36 at the time. I was highly stressed and worn down after completing a 3-year intensive graduate program, which was followed by a 3-year working residency with 50 to 60-hour work weeks. That job had a charismatic, narcissistic boss, a culture of bullying and harassment, and woven into it were influences from Scientology and transcendental meditation. And I had been inducted into and was practicing transcendental meditation at the time. So retrospectively, when I look back, I would call that workplace more than a little bit culty. And then I had recently ended a relationship, and as part of that, a few of my primary friendships had been impacted. And as an adoptee, I've always struggled with anxiety and severe depression. That's been a norm for me throughout my life. I now know that recruitment usually happens during a time of transition or situational difficulty, and certainly that would describe that time period for me. So in the last few months of this crazy work experience I was having, I met someone through work that was talking up a particular form of internal martial arts and meditation, and they asked if I wanted to learn. Again, very familiar territory. And I thought, why not? And so we met at a park, and I got sucked down the rabbit hole from there. So the practice offered what I thought was a path to maybe feeling better and a spiritual community. I had struggled so much of my life with what I now recognize to be untreated developmental trauma and complex PTSD. And at the time, I remember thinking, there's a lot of things I haven't been able to figure out on my own, and it seems like this might be helpful. When I think back now, I can see that I quickly became very involved and started to make significant lifestyle and personality changes. In the book, Take Back Your Life by Janja Lalich, there's a discussion about informed consent and how without that, you can end up not realizing what you've signed up for. In medical practices, it's legally required that one needs to have informed consent before a procedure, and that entails, what the procedure will be, what the side effects might be, and possible negative outcomes. But for cults, they typically have a public front-facing set of teachings and then inner teachings for those that are indoctrinated, and they never offer informed consent. So when I read about this, I started thinking about what it would have sounded like if my group had given me informed consent prior to recruitment. And it'll kind of give you a picture of what cult life was like for me. So it goes like this. You will quit drinking, become celibate, and follow regressive moralistic ideals that you currently abhor. You will strive to spend 4 hours a day minimum in prayer, meditation, spiritual exercises, and spiritual study, and feel like a failure if you do not meet or exceed this standard. You will provide free labor for endless projects at all hours to advance the goals of the group. You will deify your teacher, accept his beliefs as the only way, and essentially be willing to take a bullet for him. You'll be constantly on guard against worldly attachments, letting go of friendships, and getting rid of irreplaceable sentimental items. You will suffer verbal and emotional abuse, beginning with the practice of self-criticism. You will accept that all that is good comes from the teacher and the practice, and all that is bad is your fault. You'll be indoctrinated with fears and phobias that will make it very difficult to leave and will take years to sort out. You will give up medical care and seek to heal yourself through faith and purity of belief. You will lose almost a decade and feel completely behind in developmental tasks that your peers are able to manage and achieve, but that you will find totally overwhelming once you leave. You will watch members of the group suffer and die early from treatable health conditions. You will struggle with financial stability because of your involvement and leave with no savings. And you will completely lose any sense of self and autonomy in the name of exploitation and abuse masquerading as spiritual advancement. So, if they would have led with that, I would have taken a hard pass and had some choice words for them. But here we are. So I was in for 8.25 years, or just over 11 years, if you count that culty work situation. And I'm now familiar with the idea of cult hopping, which is switching from one high demand group to the next. And this is more common if someone does not have treatment or education after an experience like this. And I now really see that work situation as part of what primed me to be indoctrinated in the group that I was in.
Oh my goodness. I thank you for sharing, both of you. This, even as we prepared to have the conversation, and I kept being like, are you sure you guys want to talk about this? And because it's so personal and there's so much pain and harm that you both have experienced. So I feel grateful that you're telling your story to us, but also I'm just like feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry this happened. Okay, so Sara, let's go back to you. How did you realize that you were in this group? How did you get out? Like, what were the impacts for you on your life?
In terms of impacts, only now looking back, I can see that I was making some really poor decisions. I mean, that was number one. I wasn't attending to my family in ways that I would have if I wasn't involved in the group. I think I said this already, but the women's group was my priority attachment. It mattered the most in many ways. It interfered with my other relationships too. It distanced me from my mom, my adoptive mom, as I compared her to the charismatic leader I sought in a motherly role. And in reunion, frankly, it distanced me from my birth mother too, because I kind of just subbed in the leader of our group as is the person I wanted in a motherly role. I became really judgmental of other people, anyone in my life, other friendships that I'd had. It was hard because there was this indoctrination that they weren't doing their work. And that's in ear quotes because that's another phrase. And so it was hard to be in relationships with people when I felt judgmental of them. And then I was just sleep deprived. So I was off my game. My critical thinking skills were reduced, especially when it came to thinking of the group and anything that came up, any of the drama. And I'd be gone. I mean, it was like it was sucking me in. Like I said, my rejection fear came alive. It felt really primal and visceral and not good for my body, just all that constant cortisol. It felt life-threatening almost constantly for a couple of years. The constant drama and the thought of severing my attachments to the woman who led the group as well as the other group members. And so it just that started to wear on me. But I also, because I had so many opportunities to go deeper and deeper in terms of my involvement with the leader, and a lot of which I knowingly pursued. It was all that whole mother replacement thing was really largely at play. So it wasn't, it was two ways. I mean, I was being pursued, but I was doing pursuing too. I wanted that. But it gave her more and more information and more access to me, to my secrets, which I understood could be used against me. And I experienced used against me on several occasions. And the same was true the other way, because I had so much access to her. I had a front row seat to all of her dysfunction. And there was a lot. As I came to see, I mean, I had her on this pedestal, but it was like the Wizard of Oz, just seeing the wizard behind the curtain. The more I got to see, there was just an incredible incongruency between her teachings and her behavior. And so it just finally started to wake me up. In terms of getting out and recovering, some of it is in my memoir, not all of it. A lot of my writing ended up on the cutting room floor from my memoir because it was detracting from the larger story from a literary perspective, but the writing was helpful nonetheless. And I've definitely learned to keep secrets close, which probably sounds a little funny because my memoir is so vulnerable, but only those in my closest circle get a peek through into the deepest windows of my inner life now. I just have to be more guarded. And that goes for social media too, which is a balancing act as an author because we kind of are expected to share And I have to be careful with what I share because I've just learned some hard lessons of who my vulnerability is meant for. Friendship with Donna, it was so great when we realized that we had the same experience. I mean, we talk all the time, and we compare our cults, our experiences, and it lifts the shame. There's a playfulness. We laugh about a lot of it. And so when you're laughing at something that was deeply traumatic, it helps. When there's a flare up, we can call each other, we get each other, kind of like when you meet other adoptees, you don't have to explain, and you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's great. I mean, we're always learning new things about our stories. Just the other day, Donna mentioned she gets really cold when she's triggered and talking about this. I'm like, I do too. Like, and who knew?
Well, as I did all this reading and research, and I mean, you guys have done 50 times as much as me, but one of these common misconceptions is if I leave, I'll lose my entire network. And so can you talk to that a little bit? Because I mean, it sounds like you've built that back up for yourself, but what was that like, especially in adoptee mode? We lose our entire network at the time we are, removed from our first families. So I feel like that's a pretty strong fear that a lot of us have.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a huge driving fear for me. And at the same time, I do feel fairly lucky that one of my skills or gifts as an adoptee is that I'm a great compartmentalizer. So I said I was judging people, but I also didn't back out of all my relationships. So I was able to compartmentalize to some degree, and I still had a lot of my same friendships and my community. I had a wonderful neighborhood with lots of friends and mom friends and kids. And so not that none of them had any idea this was going on, but they were still there. So I felt very lonely when I left, and also very lonely because I didn't want to talk about it. You don't want to just strike up a conversation telling anyone who's been close to you what's been going on, that you've been having this weird double life. So it was very lonely, but I feel lucky that I hadn't walked away from my other networks. So I didn't, even though it felt very scary, once I got to the other side of that, those losses, and they were losses, I had to grieve. I did. People who I thought were my friends, and there's the betrayal, and there were friendly moments. There was compassion. There was connection with a lot of the women in the group, including the leader. And it was a loss. Like I said, I glorified her like a mother. So I had to grieve that. And grieving mother loss is, that's never ending for us. So that was painful.
How about you, Donna?
So at the beginning of 2017, I started to come out of the fog. So this was when I was still in the group, and I got involved with the local adoptee community, and I began to build some friendships outside of my group, which was new because a lot of those had fallen away. I also began reading a bunch of trauma books and adoptee books and listening to a ton of Adoptees On. Thank you, Haley. I think that was really helpful. So having hobbies or outside interests was always something that was criticized by my group. So I minimized this and kept it on the down low. I was living a double life, sort of like Sara mentioned. And so I just kind of added another compartment to that, which was the adoptee aspect. Looking back, I do feel like leaving my group was partially a rolling consequence of my coming out of the fog and the processing that I started doing around being an adoptee. So things in the group had become increasingly difficult. There were group dynamics and directions that I was growing really uncomfortable with and was confused and upset by. I was also becoming very worn down by what I was beginning to recognize as verbal and emotional abuse. I really started trying to create space as much as I could. And so this was early spring through fall of 2018. And I wasn't fully conscious of why I was doing it. I just knew that I needed to. That September, we went on a family cruise, and I was out of touch with the group for 2 weeks. And at that point, I was beginning to take back small bits of myself. So I remember taking Dramamine on that trip, and it was the first time that I'd taken medicine in 8 years. So it was sort of that next month after that I realized I really wanted to leave and that I wanted to do it as quietly as possible and with the least amount of waves and blowback. So I never discussed concerns with my group. I knew exactly what they thought and how they thought about things and that there were no room for questions. So I decided to send emails to 3 of the main coordinators, telling them that I had some personal things to take care of and that I was stepping away, and I didn't offer any other explanations. I'll share that the group was highly paranoid about security, which I think is common when it's a system created by a traumatizing narcissist, a megalomaniac. And so as part of that, we had our own internal email platforms, servers, and apps for projects. And within the hour of my sending those emails, my access was cut off. So kind of like you were talking about that walking away, I think another important aspect of informed consent should include discussion of exit costs when you leave a group like this. So for me, when I left what had started as a beloved spiritual practice, I walked away from some of my closest friends, from my community, my belief system, my volunteer work, how I made purpose and meaning, how I oriented in everyday life, and I went into what felt like a spiritual free fall. Once I was out, I began to realize how diminished my autonomy was, and that I was indoctrinated with fears and phobias around safety, health, and spiritual annihilation that felt very scary. And it wasn't until I was fully separated from the group that I could even begin to think or to say the words, I think I just left a cult. And once I recognized that, I started figuring out how to deprogram myself and trying to make sense of what just happened. As an example of what this time was like, a friend that I had been fortunate to make prior to leaving the group, who was not part of the group, she had invited me out with her friends for a local event and dinner. And this was at least a few months after I was out. And the experience I found unexpectedly disorienting. So there were really basic things that I couldn't relate to and I didn't know how to talk about. And I realized I was experiencing a kind of culture shock, and it felt like I had just come back from a foreign country. It was surprising because it's a really uncomfortable experience to have when you haven't left home. And I also hadn't fully recognized at that point the cost of my experience. I was just beginning to recognize and realize that. When I think back to when I joined, the rapid change in belief, I can remember it making me a bit unsteady, but accompanied with that was this rush of what I thought was a spiritual awakening and also love bombing by my new community. And this releases a bunch of neurochemicals, kind of like falling in love. But by the time I left, my nervous system was shattered and I was drenched in fear and confusion, shame and grief. And for me, there was nothing that tempered the difficulty of leaving, like the feel-good hormones I had when I got in. I was just, completely overwhelmed. So I'm now around the anniversary of being out 3 years, and I'm continuing to unpack the experience. I will say, in the language of off script, what I'm loving right now are boundaries. They're my new favorite thing. So I'm growing a practice of having good boundary hygiene, is what I call it. And, when I look back on my trauma history, I was bullied by a peer with narcissistic traits through childhood and into adulthood. And this really taught me how to fall in step with narcissists. To me, they seem unpleasant, but very familiar. And sometimes I feel like I've got a glowing beacon on my head, like they see me coming a mile away and they love me. But now I'm working on being able to see them much sooner and to calibrate my boundaries accordingly. And I'm also working on building a muscle memory of what safe and safe enough feels like. And, I'll say the process of recovery has been slow, but I'm just really glad that I got out when I did.
Thank you for sharing that. And I know, one reason why you guys are so concerned for the adoptee community, because you see this thing that maybe we're more susceptible. And, you mentioned, and for both of you, that this sort of happened in a time of transition. So like Sara, mom to young kids. And so this is new, motherhood is new, we're exhausted. You're not thinking straight. I'm sorry. That's sleep deprivation in itself, right? Mothering. And then, and Donna, for you as well, time of transition. And so I feel like there's so many periods of that for humans. Of course, we all go through those things. But what about adoptees specifically? Have you guys seen that you want to let people know, like, be aware of this? You're more susceptible during these particular times.
And there's a few things I just want to share about the intersections of adoption with the cult experience. And in my readings, I've come across a lot of examples of cults causing and promoting family separation and relinquishment, as well as they're bringing children into groups. This was potentially at play in my beginnings, had the potential to be. So I want to give a couple other examples that I've come across, and just a little trigger warning here. The first two examples are dark. So the Australian cult known as the Family imprisoned at least 22 children. The female leader stole children through adoption scams or by convincing her followers to relinquish children to her. All of the kids were told the leader was their biological mother. Their identities were changed to make them look eerily similar, and they were all given false birth certificates. And this came to light when one of them was able to escape in 1987, and the leader evaded authorities until 1993 when she was finally caught. Jim Jones of the People's Temple and the Jonestown Massacre, which is sometimes referred to as a mass suicide, had 6 or 8 adopted children. I've seen both numbers. And he encouraged his followers to adopt children. And there are also 150 Mendocino County children that were recorded to have been placed in foster homes connected with the People's Temple through their history. And so that would be the time period from when they were in California until they were down in Guyana. At the time of the tragedy, some records say that there might have been 19 children that had recently been in foster care. And it's hard to know how many of the 300 children who died in 1978 were possibly also adoptees. A more mild example would be Alexandra Stein. She's the one whose more formal definition of a cult I shared in the beginning. And she shared that her cult leader arranged her marriage and instructed her to adopt children. Interestingly, her work focuses on the attachment perspective of cultic involvement. So I thought that's interesting as an adoptive mother, that's the direction that she went to. As far as our susceptibility, I'm a fan of Daniel Shaw's work and his most recent book, Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery. He says a person with a history of chronically dysregulated shame states could be particularly susceptible to the alluring promises of liberation made by cults. So as an adoptee, I feel like shame was in the first breath I took and has been a lifelong companion. It's also the lifeblood of cults and narcissistic abuse. And I think there's also something to be said about the systematic oppression by the adoption industry through taking access to our identity, our heritage, our medical histories, and generally supporting a narrative around adoptees needing to be grateful for our trauma. Certainly that has the potential to set us up for chronically dysregulated shame states. And, it's no wonder that we find ourselves overrepresented in so many treatment populations. And I think Sarah and I are always wondering if adoptees are overrepresented in sort of the cult population or high demand group population. Lastly, I'll just share, it's not like cults are out looking for adoptees. They're not looking for a particular personality type. But some researchers have said that untreated developmental trauma can leave one susceptible. As part of that, many of us also have challenges with identity development, and cults will hand you a prepackaged, ready-made identity. And they also offer a great opportunity for spiritual bypass. So, I thought my involvement would help me to feel better, but that's the bait and switch of a group like this. They make great promises up front, but, I was in a much worse state when I got out.
I think charismatic leaders, there's a motherly quality to charismatic leaders, and not all cult leaders are women, but there is a motherly component. And I think for those of us who are used to searching for mothers, looking for mother figures, we have had our mother figures interchanged already, that there's something that can hook us there. That was one thing that definitely hooked me. I mentioned this already, but we have an innate need to belong.
And for me, I go into people-pleasing mode in order to belong. I can contort myself to fit in, and that happens to serve a cult very well. If you have those skills, I joke about skills, but if you have those leanings to do that, then that does serve the cult. And like I said, with my experience, just this sense that something's wrong with us that requires fixing. I think we need to be really strong thinkers around psychology-based cults. And that's not to say psychology. I mean, I'm a huge fan of therapy. I have therapists, plural, but psychology-based cults are a thing. And so just being aware of that. And, for me, lately in therapy, it's like accepting that I'm not some broken mess that I've got to do my fixing. It's just like compassion. So I think, just being mindful of those dynamics. Our pursuit of love, I think, can hook us. When someone's pursuing us with love, for me, that was such a hole. I wanted to be pursued by my birth mother. I wanted pursued, and I never felt that. I had to find her. And so when I felt like I was being pursued by someone who seemed like a really charismatic, warm person, it got me. It's brought up on the show a lot, but traditional therapy can be a disappointment. And so I think in our hunger to seek healing, we can feel drawn to non-traditional ways. And that doesn't mean all non-traditional ways are cults, but it just means we need to take the blinders off, be really aware. I was someone who felt fearful and anxious all the time. Anxiety is just the thread under everything. And so frankly, a structure with hierarchy, and cults have hierarchy, and that appealed to me. It seemed safe. It seemed like someone else would be in charge, and there's something that appealed to me there. Donna touched on this, but just cult leaders are malignant narcissists, and not all, but many adoptive parents can have narcissistic tendencies. So it's something that we're used to being around. It might feel normal. Cults operate on getting us not to trust our intuition, and adoption teaches us not to trust our intuition. I mean, from the very beginning, right? I mean, we know we don't have the words, but we know we're in the wrong family. We're not supposed to be here. What happened? And so we've learned not to trust our intuition, but we need to trust it. It's there, and we've got to tap back into it. There's a huge, and this has been going on for a while, but a transformation trend. And what adoptee with developmental trauma doesn't feel they need transformation or answers to fix something that isn't there? So doesn't mean, again, I'm not saying it's all bad, but it just means be mindful, pay attention. I touched on the compartmentalizing. I think adoptees tend to be good compartmentalizers. And so that can lead us into thinking it's not a cult if it looks like it's just a women's group. We can compartmentalize and talk ourselves out of it. And times of transitions, like we talked about, for me, it was being a new parent and coming out of the fog. Those are two huge life transitions. So be careful if you're coming out of the fog. It's a heavy time and a very deep time, very emotional, as is a new parent, like you said, Haley. So much sleep deprivation alone, just the physical, feeding it and caring for a brand new infant. Paul Sunderland, in his CAD presentation, talked about how adoptees have a proneness to religiosity and fundamentalism. I happened to catch that. I rewatched it recently, and I was like, oh, say more. I wish, but it was just one of his bullet points. But I was like, okay, noted. And someday I want to hear more about that. But I have seen that in my circles too. And as Donna is working on, boundaries can be an issue for us as adoptees, and that makes it really easy for cults to take advantage of us when we don't have the firm boundaries.
First, thank you both. Those were really insightful, really helpful. Donna, do you have anything to say to people who might think like they're listening to you guys and like there's little light bulbs going off? They're like, wait, am I in this? What is happening? Do you have anything to say to those folks?
I do, for sure. I just want to touch on first a couple of the misconceptions that can happen with cults. And, one is that, and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, that we have misconceptions because of how they've been presented. And often that's because, coverage usually speaks to some of the most sensationalized aspects and not the nuances of manipulation and undue influence. And so it can leave people thinking, for example, that they wouldn't join a women's group that wants to brand you, as in the example of NXIVM. But that coverage doesn't really necessarily highlight the way groups work, and that they never lead with their most egregious aspects, that it's this multi-layered process. Cults also exist in many contexts and formats, and they can be two-person or small family groups. And I think of the book Educated by Tara Westover as an example of this, as well as the movie Kajillionaire. Or they can have a large number of followers like my group. They can be religious, psychotherapy, or educational, like Sarah's example, political, cults of personality, commercial cults, and that includes MLMs. And so that would be like the LuLaRich docuseries on Amazon. And, if you think that you're in a group, I would say be a good consumer. If there's a group that interests you, do your research, vet them with multiple sources, not only information being created by the group itself, which can be misleading, especially if it's a cult. Look for checks and balances in governance, transparency about finances and decision-making processes, what kind of accountability practices the group has, if there's free and open access to information about the group itself, a spirit of free thinking, and a culture of being able to hold differing opinions and ask questions. If you're wondering if you're in a cult, you can look at the BITE model of authoritarian control by Stephen Hassan on his Freedom of Mind website. And so this stands for control in the areas of behavior, information, thought, and emotion, and it can be used to assess the level of control that a group exerts over its members. So if you look at this and you find many bullet points checked off, I would encourage you to do more investigation, talk to someone outside of your group that can be trusted and that can help you reality test your experience and maybe connect with resources. I'll also say it's never too soon to leave a cult, but some of these groups do have an element of physical danger. And if that's the case, do it carefully, make a safety plan, find outside resources. If you have the financial means, when you get out, get exit counseling and trauma therapy as soon as possible. I think, I didn't know about it at the time, but when I look back, I think my recovery would have gone much quicker if I would have gotten exit counseling really early on. And I just want to share one other thing. Sarah and I both got in and got out as adults. And so our experiences don't represent what it's like to be born or adopted into a cult or a high demand group. And there's a different layer of experience there that our stories don't speak to. ICSA, the International Cultic Studies Association, has resources for all former members, but they have some very specific to second generation and multi-generational former group members.
Yeah, Donna, that was excellent. So comprehensive. I would say on a really kind of basic level, trust your intuition. There's a great book by Gavin de Becker called The Gift of Fear, and he also wrote Protecting the Gift. 2 books I really strongly recommend. And it's all about trusting your intuition. And for me, I those are books I need to reread multiple times because, again, the intuition, it's hard as adoptees trusting our intuition. So regardless of whether you think it's a cult or not, if something's giving you red flags and like a gut feeling, listen to it. I can't remember which book. I think it's Protecting the Gift. He writes about deer, when they are looking at a lion, aren't sitting there going, I wonder if that's really a lion. Like, they're not Googling, is that a lion? They're not analyzing it. They had a gut intuition that it's a lion and they steer clear. So we have that intuition in us. It's not like it's gone. We're just not great all the time about listening to it. And I wasn't. Dark humor is one of the things to listen to. And as an example, one of the women in my group would often joke in front of everybody, oh, as long as you're not making us jump into a pond of cauliflower, it's all good. And we would all laugh. And it was insinuating that, okay, it's not a cult until you're making us jump into this pond. And it was dark humor. And we all nervously laughed because we agreed that was telling us something and none of us listened to it. We all talked about a lot of us talked about every week having this gut vibe not to come, but we'd force our way through it. And that was part of the doctrination, was that you had to abandon, your ego, that was ego, but it wasn't. That was a handy tool for the cults to use that, but it was to get us not trust our intuition. And I would just say educate. Read books such as Alexandra Stein's that Donna's referenced, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, that focuses on attachment in particular and cults, podcasts on cults, cult shows. And, I think just the underlying all of the cult thing, just continue to work on the grief work that comes with being an adoptee and the therapy that goes along with that. That's a constant, ever evolving thing. And if you're feeling the grief, I think that it just keeps you healthier, keeps us more whole. So I would, add those in.
Thank you so much both for, I could tell, extensive preparation, so many good things, so many resources. And I think it's a good time for us to go to do recommended resources now. But I will try and link to all the different things that Sara and Donna mentioned. So don't worry. You can go look in the show notes and find those things. But is there anything specific that you guys want to recommend today? I'm not going to talk about any of the things that I read or viewed or listened to, but I will link to a couple of the YouTube videos I watched and things. And I'll link those in the show notes, but I want to give you guys a chance to go ahead and share. So Donna, what about you? What would you like to recommend to folks today?
I've been listening to the podcast A Little Bit Culty with Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Ames. And they were some of the NXIVM whistleblowers. And I appreciate that they're kind of doing their healing real time and publicly on the podcast. They also have good guests on from the cultic studies and cultic recovery field. And I feel like similar to the benefits of listening to Adoptees on, my group recovery is an area where I find it important to connect with community that resonates and reflects my experience. And the podcast A Little Bit Culty has been one of the ways that I've done that.
You know what? I've been listening to it and I really appreciate there's jokes about being in the group.
Right.
That they can tell now, and I think, oh, this is the in-group, the laughter and things that afterwards you can look back on and be like, can you believe we did that?
Yeah.
I think that makes it very human and real. And I second that. I'm really finding it fascinating. It's very good.
I'm glad you've checked that out. That's great.
And Sara, how about you?
Well, it's going to be a NXIVM theme because the HBO series, The Vow, if you haven't watched it, was excellent. So good. I think so relatable to in many ways on a much larger scale than the group I was involved in. But just, it's fascinating. It's fascinating seeing the process and how people how they got in, what the draw was, how they suspended their skepticism. An example of a leader who claims to understand the human condition and promise personal development and growth. They had a subgroup within the group and how the women were working to do the bidding of a narcissistic leader and just how that came to be. And then, fascinating just seeing how it unfolds. So yeah, I guess a NXIVM theme today, but yeah, it's a good one.
That's great. Thank you both so much. I know that this was hard to talk about and there's a big cost to sharing. So I'm so grateful you said what you have and appreciate your work on this. And I know it's definitely going to help adoptees be on the lookout and adoptees who have perhaps been in a group and have left. And I know that you both have connected with other adopted people who have had similar experiences to yours. So thank you. Thank you so much. Donna, where can people connect with you online?
They can reach out to me via email. It's adoptee3@gmail.com.
Perfect. And Sara, how about you?
Probably the best way is through my website, saraeasterly.com, and all my links to all my channels are there. Instagram's my fun place where I spend most of the time.
Wonderful. And they can check out your memoir there as well. Thank you so much, Donna and Sara. Really appreciate your time on this. Today is definitely a day you want to head to the show notes because Donna and Sara prepared extra resources for you. And I also found a few things I found were really, really helpful when I was learning more about this topic before we recorded. And so links to everything are on adopteeson.com. And if you are listening in your favorite podcast app, if you just click on the show art, you should get straight through to the show notes. Swipe right or left or click on the art, and depending on the podcast app, it should be there for you. I am so thankful for folks that are willing to talk about the hard, challenging things so we can learn from them. And, they really had this heart to share because they don't want you to get tangled up in anything like they were. So I'm really appreciative of that place where Donna and Sara both come from, of like protecting adopted people. And I just think what a beautiful way to serve the community, even though talking about some of these things can be so challenging and takes a toll. I'm so thankful for people like Donna and Sara who are willing to serve us in that way. So thank you so much, ladies. Appreciate your candor. I also want to say thank you because Donna and Sara and almost 300 other folks are Patreon supporters, and they keep this podcast going. It is fully crowdfunded, so you don't hear advertisements, except for Patreon ads, I suppose. I'm giving you an ad right now. If you sign up to support the show, it is a huge gift to the community. There are bonuses you can access in Patreon. So if you go to adopteeson.com/partner, all the levels of support are available there. And the first level, you get access to the Adoptees Off Script podcast episodes, which are another weekly podcast, a little more casual, a little more chatty, still talking about adoptee things most of the time. But it's lots of the times it's things that I'm like, I'm glad this is behind a paywall so that thousands of people are not hearing this, because I probably overshare a little too much there. So if you want to know more Haley, that's where that is. And there's also a private Facebook group that you can join at another level of Patreon where it is adoptee only. And people will come and share their stories in there. Sometimes they will come and ask for advice or support, and we try only to give advice when it's asked for. It is really a beautiful community, and it is one of my most, I'm really proud of all the people in there who are willing to share the hard stuff and then also give back. And so I see that happening in that Facebook group all the time, which I'm so proud of. And yes, and then there's folks that are just able to give more, and they do. And that keeps the show going. It helps me pay myself, my editor, my hosting bills, the website bills, all the things that go into a high production podcast. So if you're wondering how the show magically appears in your podcast app every week, that's why. It's my Patreon supporters. They are waving a magic wand and poof, here it is, the show. Anyway, that's a long infomercial. Sorry about that. Anyway, I am so thankful for you guys. You know who you are. Almost 300 of you. Thank you. If I could give you a big hug in person, I would. You make the show possible. So big love to you. And if you can't support the show financially, no problem. Someone else has your back. Someone else signed up. Someone else is taking care of that for you. One huge gift you can do is share the show with one other person, one other adopted person you know that you're like, I think they might need to hear this episode about cults. It's super interesting, and maybe they've been in a few different groups before, and maybe there's some red flags they need to look out for. Just share it with one person. That is a huge gift to me and a huge gift to them. Thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.